Welcome to the third edition of the interview series hosted by the UN Women Training Centre's Community of Practice. My name is Ria Lagari, consultant for the Training Centre, and I'm very lucky to be joined today by Dr. Elisabeth Hofmann, who will be speaking about training for gender equality in the Francophone world. Let me begin by explaining that this COP interview series features a range of interviews with experts on topics related to training for gender equality. This started in June 2017 and will run until December. Each interview lasts about half an hour, and our listeners have the chance to ask questions by either clicking on the hand-raising tab at the end of the interview or by sending in their questions at any time using the questions tab on the right-hand side of the webinar platform. So let's begin. I'm going to introduce our guest for today. Dr. Elisabeth Hofmann is a member of the Francophone Genre en Action network, and she's an assistant professor at the Université Bordeaux-Montaigne in France. She's also the UNESCO Chair of Vocational Training and Sustainable Development at the university. As an experienced development consultant, Elisabeth has worked as an evaluator, consultant, and trainer, particularly in West Africa, in Morocco, Madagascar, and Kenya. Her work focuses on integrating gender in development projects, promoting participatory approaches, participatory evaluation, and adult education. So Elisabeth, welcome. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you.
Perfect. And so let's begin. I'll ask you to please tell us a little bit about your experiences of training for gender equality in Francophone countries, and especially what particular positive opportunities do you feel exist for training in Francophone countries?
Mm-hmm. I have to explain that I'm actually of German origin, which is not unimportant because I think my long-standing interest in gender is a little bit linked to the fact that I grew up in another country than France. I've started to work as a gender trainer in African settings, actually Francophone African settings. I think it's in Madagascar that I did my first training. I have integrated university after a quite long career as a consultant and a trainer. So teaching at university came a little bit later. I'm not teaching only gender, which is an important issue as well in both the practitioners field and in the university, because I'm also teaching project cycle methodology, very sort of sound methodological stuff, and sometimes with the same students, and it does give me some credibility that I would find more difficult to gain if I taught only about gender, I think. So I have been teaching NGO personnel first, and little by little also master students, bachelor students, and I also have been teaching in for example, the French Agence Française de Développement, French Development Institution in the French Foreign Ministry. So I have a quite wide range of training experiences in the Francophone settings.
Wonderful. And I wanted to ask you a little bit about, because obviously when we speak about the Francophone world, as we mentioned before, that we're not speaking about one particular country, we're speaking about a great birth of very different, very distinct cultural settings, very distinct, countries, very different attitudes towards gender perhaps, and especially across rural-urban divides against, there are many, many differences in this huge setting. But in terms of training for gender equality, what do you feel the specific opportunities are for training for gender equality in this setting? Do you feel, for example, in the Anglo-Saxon world or Anglophone settings, I would say, is there some sort of resistance towards gender training perhaps in Francophone settings as I think you mentioned before that it might be seen as an Anglo imposition on French-speaking countries?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. You're right. I mean, the Francophone world is not at all a homogeneous cultural area, and I think France as such is a particular case. So what are the opportunities? I guess one of the opportunities is that there are French resources about gender equality that can be mobilized, and France is a country that has been sort of influencing all of the Francophone countries, especially Francophone African countries, which I know best, I guess, in the Francophone world. I'm thinking of historical figures like Olympe de Gouges, who during the French Revolution and at the moment when sort of the human rights, the first version of the human rights were declared in France, she actually came up and said there's women's human rights as well. And then there is Simone de Beauvoir, whom we use a lot to show that it might be a concept that in the development context comes to us through the Anglo-Saxon world. But I mean, Simone de Beauvoir said in the 60s already that that we are not born as women, but that we are actually educated and elevated as women through education, through culture, through upbringing. So those are real opportunities to show that it's a quite universal concept, and that in France, in French history and in French culture, there are real historical resources about this issue.
And do you draw on these usually when you train?
I draw on these also to show that it's an issue that is quite independent of historical settings and of sort of geographical issues, because at every time in history and in every part of the world there were always sort of progressive forces that contested the relative oppression of women. I say relative because there's enormous variations, obviously, but yeah, I think in all countries, in all societies, in urban and rural settings, there is always progressive forces that do not find it normal that women have less power than men. So this is something I think that's important to mention, even though it seems obvious, but it's not that well understood by everybody, especially when you're training sort of gender skeptical yeah.
And how do you feel in terms of maybe not skepticism, but also just in general, the challenges that exist when you're talking about such a very diverse span of countries and very diverse, I'm sure, stakeholders within them. For example, it can't be the same to train local communities in Francophone Africa as it is maybe to train institutions in Francophone Africa or in Quebec or in Switzerland or in France. It must be very difficult. So how do you approach these two? I know this is a very broad question, but how would you approach these two very different groups of stakeholders in your training?
Well, there is actually a particular challenge that is especially strong in France, which is the fact that in French culture there is a very universalist approach to equality. There is this idea that all individuals are equal. It's really an abstract universalism. So it's quite hard to think of the society as being composed by subgroups, also along gender divides, that have different rights, different opportunities, that face different challenges. And that's quite difficult because there's always a bit of this sort of issue around, but if we accept the gender divide, then we actually call into question this universal claim for equality. That's very important. And as France has been sort of culturally very influential in especially the Francophone South, we sometimes do find similar arguments. I mean, especially when we train, for example, administrative staff, people that have often been trained in sort of a cultural French setting, even if it's not in France, it's France itself. On a community level, I think the question we face is a lot more on cultural lines. This whole idea of, but gender is something imported. Gender is maybe okay for Europe or for North America, but it's not a local issue. We have other priorities. We have other main issues, or basically it's something that is too threatening for sort of local harmony. This is one of the arguments that sometimes comes up. Are you not sort of sowing tensions amongst social actors in the community by raising these issues, because complementarity is our main important value more than equality. So those are very different kinds of challenges. But I think on community level the challenges we face are actually quite similar than in Anglo-Saxon settings. It's more on the level of stakeholders on on a higher level of decision making where the issues are quite different.
And do you feel, how do you engage, for example, where the universalist approach comes up? And for example, if you're training at, well, maybe not to name names, but just in a large institution, perhaps, and you're confronted with this universalist argument, which is, sort of at odds with the idea that, different groups have different needs and different, dilemmas. They face different challenges. So how would you address them, or how do you address them?
Very often we try to really, I say we because it's an approach we have been working a lot on inside of Genre en Action. We actually, I can mention that as a side remark, we actually worked on a référentiel, it's like a frame of reference for gender training, for training trainers in gender and development with Le Monde Selon les Femmes, a Belgian organization, and other French NGOs. So we've been thinking a lot about how we can actually try and address these issues in a more general way. One of the options is to actually try and accompany all the participants in a training workshop to look at their own lives, how their own lives have been maybe influenced, the whole life course has been influenced by the fact that they're a woman or a man or another gender, but yeah, how the gender identity has been a very decisive element in their life course. And often this own sort of introspective way of looking at things makes them become more clear, be more clear about, there is equality in a formal way, especially in a French setting. There is no formal issue today, but in every life, in everyday life or in the life course of an individual, the gender question is an important issue, and we do not really effectively enjoy the same chances and the same rights. So yeah, this is a way of trying to make them aware of the fact that this abstract universalism is just too abstract and too deconnected with individual life experiences.
Mm-hmm. So the gap, I suppose, between what the theory and the practice, how we abstractly consider the world and how the world really is, and how people's life experiences really are.
Yeah, and the other issue we try and introduce is sort of an intersectional approach to try and show them that we can say the same about, I don't know, people of different ethnic origins or different colors, or of course theoretically we all have the same rights, but we know that in everyday life it's not the same. The probability of being controlled by police is a lot higher if I'm not white, or if I'm young, etc. So these kind of issues often help to make clear that there is real differences between women and men, and also amongst women, obviously, if there's different social categories. And so there's this question also of trying to make them understand that obviously working with gender does not mean that we only look at the differences between women and men, but that we actually try and look more generally into constructed identities and how this actually is the origin of socially constructed differences and inequalities.
Excellent. And as you spoke about intersectionality, I was wondering, because in the Anglophone world, I've read a lot recently about different trainers having a sort of issue with the idea of gender and diversity training when they bring in more than just one category, when it's just more than gender. And they see it as perhaps running the risk of lumping together different categories and then diluting, feminist politics, or the feminist aspect of it, or the gender aspect, the aspect of women. Is that also the case in Francophone settings? Is that also something within the Francophone gender training community? Is that something that is of concern?
Of course, I think that is really a general problem. How can we really keep a feminist agenda and not sort of dilute gender into a whole lot of other factors that are actually determining discrimination. Yeah, I think in the Francophone setting it is more easy to address issues of racism, for example. So sometimes the comparison helps to make clear that even though we are the same, we're equal in front of the law. In everyday life, we are not that equal, and our chances to get a good job are not the same, and our chances to sort of climb up the ladder of the career are not the same, etc. So when you make these comparisons, that helps. But obviously there's this issue of will we not lose focus on gender equality. I think it is a question that really complexifies gender training to address the intersectional issue. But then again, for many people it is important actually that we do recognize and acknowledge that women are not all the same, they're not a homogeneous group. For example, when I have people that are in the training and they say, well, but I'm not working especially on gender, I'm working with the youth. Well, young people, most of the young people are men or women or of another gender, but I mean, they're also determined by their gender. So the intersectional approach also helps them to stay open towards the gender approach, even though maybe they're focused on other subgroups on a primary level, or for example groups working with disabled people. Then again, it's a good example to say, yeah, look at the women that are disabled. Do they face the same challenges? Do they have the same problems than disabled men? Are they being taken care of in the same way, etc.? So it is also in a way an opportunity, I find, but I do agree that it really complexifies issues. So this is also one of the reasons why I think a key issue in gender training is really the length and the time you're being given as a gender trainer to really go into depth and to really explain issues and to really sort of explore different threads of thought and reflection and discussion that come up in the gender training, in order to not leave your trainees with a superficial understanding of what gender can be.
Of course. Your colleague from Jeune en Action, Claudie Vouet, when she participated in our last virtual dialogue webinar, she did mention how, you know, one-off trainings or recipe trainings can be really problematic for trainees. And is that something that, you know, the Francophone training, you know, trainers are moving away from, or are they able to move away from them?
It's always an issue of negotiation. It's really an issue of negotiation. Very often, yeah, we are sort of asked to do 1 day, 2 day maximum gender training. We sort of moved away from the half-day form. But yeah, we were sort of supposed to train somebody in 2 days, Monday morning until Tuesday evening, and then somebody is trained in gender, which is obviously ridiculous. Not only about gender, but in general about adult training. I mean, you don't train adults just like this, disconnected from their work situation and from their daily lives. You really have to be in a situation where you mobilize their own experiences there and their sort of life situation. But yeah, that's just a general issue. So I think we do advance also in a French setting specifically, where we started to have actually the first trainings with the follow-up session 6 months later, and with the possibility that the trainers actually stay in touch at least through telephone or by mail during this first training session, which lasts 2 days, and then the follow-up session 6 months later of 1 day. This is really the new formula, new formula, but it is an evolution in the right direction in this sense. I'm really glad about it. Obviously, where it's more difficult is if you're doing training far away, but what we try to negotiate is that we always train for Genre en Action. It's one of the principles. Our majority of our members are actually from Francophone Africa. So if we train elsewhere than in France, then we always try to train with local trainers and we try to negotiate that these local trainers are there to do follow-up and yeah, so that we actually look at gender training as a whole process that obviously takes more than just a couple of days and an on-site training, and that acknowledges the necessity to really accompany the trainees in the application of what they actually learn in the sort of inside setting.
Mm-hmm. And you, drawing on that, I think it's very interesting when you speak about the kind of training experiences that Generaction has, and the kind of, so I was wondering if your work on addressing school-related gender-based violence, is that also through Generaction, or is that separate?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I worked quite a lot through Genre en Action on that issue, but I also did a little bit of research work more on my university side. But yeah, with Genre en Action, we actually had two e-learnings about gender-based violence in school settings, or school-related, which means it can be also school-related gender-based violence amongst two stakeholders that know each other through school, even if it's maybe geographically completely elsewhere. So yeah, of course, gender training has been very important in this issue, because one of the important points is to actually identify what is gender-based violence in a school-related setting, especially in the West African context, which is the context I have worked on this issue, contexts where school is a relatively violent place, where yeah, students are still punished by beatings or slappings or something like that if they don't learn well, where violence is a kind of form of pedagogy. So speaking about school-related gender-based violence is something that is not necessarily clear at the beginning. So it's really important to really work on the issue on what does this mean, what are we trying to point out, what are different types of violence, especially also non-physical violence. Very often in a Francophone African setting, the idea is to say school-related gender-based violence is sexual violence, which is, of course, a very important issue in school-related gender-based violence, but there is many other forms of school-related, yeah, psychological violences or other forms of yeah, discriminations or harassment that are really can be considered as violence. Huh? So yeah, training is very important so that we make clear what we really speak about. And then also because the educational sector, yeah, the approach has been very much universalist once again. We want to try and really teach all children without any difference. That is sort of a basic ethical stance of the teachers. So it's not that easy to say, yeah, but watch out, you have sort of half of your students, if things go well, it's half of them that might actually not hear the same thing than the others, or might not might need to be encouraged differently, or might need to be yeah, sort of taken care of in a bit different way. So yeah, it is important to really work on this issue, especially in the setting where we worked so hard, where everybody worked so hard to actually catch up the low school attendance of girls for a long time. You know? So coming up with school-related gender-based violence is a bit seen as counterproductive by stakeholders, because all of a sudden we say, oh, it's great that girls are in school, but we have to be careful.
And is this training, is it directed towards, staff members, is it towards students or local authorities, or does it target broader groups?
Yeah, what we did with Genre en Action was basically an online course that targeted actually NGO stuff. NGOs that often worked actually in favor of girls' school attendance. Then there was also the question of maintaining girls in school, and so question of school-related gender-based violence came obviously up as one of the issues that are important. Next to economic issues or other matters that can actually, yeah, sort of be obstacles on the way to school for girls. But obviously, yeah, on other levels, not in my own personal experience, but experience of partners, there is training also with other stakeholders. For example, I had quite a close look into training of union members, school teacher unions, which was obviously very delicate because the unions had sort of a tendency to protect the teachers. And it was just really interesting to see how once we actually managed to get them on board in the sense of making them aware of the importance of school-related gender-based violence and of making them aware that their role is just incredibly crucial in identifying school-related gender-based violence and in engaging actions against. Yeah, there was very important sort of action being taken, for example, through conception of code of conducts for teachers, etc. But yeah, sort of union-driven initiatives, which was, I think, a very constructive way of addressing the issue. Yeah, gender training.
I think it sounds. Sorry. I think it sounds very constructive and very positive. And I wondered, because since it was an online course, did you find that, because, you know, there's so many debates about online training and face-to-face training and whether, you know, which one has more merit or whether they should be blended. And in your experience of this training course, do you feel that, you know, it did all that you wanted it to do? Was it a useful experience to work online, or do you feel that blended courses offered more, or what's your opinion?
No, I really think it is sort of a second best choice.
Okay.
Obviously, it's a very pragmatic choice because we can actually bring together virtually online people that would not be able to come together physically, yeah, taking into account our budget restraints. But yeah, I mean, the importance in gender training of actually exchanging and discussing not only with the trainers but also amongst trainees is just so high. And yeah, online it is just not as dynamic, the exchanges, and I do feel that it should be more of a supplementary to sort of inside moments of bringing everybody together and having them exchange really face to face, and being able to sort of go on in a discussion where sort of the thread is going further and further. And so yeah, I do feel that we must be very much aware of the importance of face-to-face training also. Online training can be a sort of a supplement or can be an additional issue. But yeah, I would be very sort of concerned about substituting too much yeah, on-site training through sort of virtual courses, because it's not the same when you try to do really formative learning experiences.
Of course, I think the face-to-face has a lot of merits, and a lot of, especially the interactivity element is a very big element of it. And well,
no.
yes, very much so. And I don't know if anyone has any questions. I think no one has sent in any questions, so I'm going to ask you another question because we still have a little bit of time, and it's been a very interesting interview. And I wonder, because since we're talking about different kinds of, you know, training, and you mentioned at the beginning that you came to the academic world after having worked as a consultant working with NGOs for a long time. So so I wanted to ask, just how did you come to be a gender trainer, and specifically since you teach on other aspects as well, what attracted you to this, and how did you become a trainer?
Oh, it's my own personal engagement that comes really from yeah, from my teenage years. And I was actually doing myself a PhD in development economics, and at the time I wanted to do a PhD on gender and development economics, and I was told that I'm just not in the right department, that gender is for the sociologist, but it's not possible to do a thesis on a PhD thesis on gender and development economics. At least at the time it wasn't possible, but now even in France it is possible. So things are
Wow.
going in the right way. But yeah, for
Mhm.
me, so it's really a long-standing engagement on a feminist level, and then professionally I worked in development, and obviously for me it was clear that I have to make the link. Yeah, in particularly trying to integrate these questions of relationship between men and women into development projects. This is where I really realized that it's just not at all obvious for everybody, and that it's not just a question of sort of having, yeah, being willing to do it, but there are competencies behind this, and there's knowledge, and there's tools and methods behind it. So you have to be trained to really integrate yeah, this whole gender issue into your work in a development context.
Mhm. Excellent. And what do you feel about trainers who train by learning by doing? Because it sounds like you'd be more in favor of that than following an academic route, because I suppose you can learn a lot. No, I mean, you can learn a lot, I think, as an academic, but when you're talking about training, I think you really need to be trained to train, I suppose. And do you feel that, is there a way that you can be professionalized purely academically, or would it have to be by learning by doing?
Mm. Well, I myself did learning by doing, because at the time there was not really any opportunity. I mean, I've got gray hair, it's quite a while ago. But yeah, today there are opportunities, which is a very good thing. But of course, it is very important that it's not just training inside the ivory towers of university, but that it's training also linked to realities and linked to practice. So I think there's no sort of general way of saying, yeah, academic training is no good, or learning by doing is always better, because it depends very much on the individual. But yeah, what is an important issue, at least in a French and Francophone setting more generally as well, is that gender is not an academic field as such. So not a discipline, an academic discipline. So for example, in my university, we just opened a gender master course, but it's only a second master course. The students have to have another master course in a discipline,
Oh, in
history,
another field.
philosophy, or languages, or they can only do it as a second master, which is very typical of how gender, yeah, made its way into universities in France, but still in a way that is sort of not comparable to classical disciplines that have been taught in French universities for a long time. So this is one of the issues. And then there's also really the yeah, sort of applied part of gender training that I find very important. And yes, I think you need to be trained to be a gender trainer. I'm very critical about the self-proclaimed gender trainers that have done one of these gender courses that starts Monday morning and ends, I don't know which day of the week in the evening, and then say they're gender trainers. I'm really critical about that indeed, because I do think that every gender training also sort of tackles the trainees in their personal life situation. So it is important that your experience, that you can actually deal with everything that comes up, all the questions, all the sometimes tension comes up, or fear, or really sort of unpleasant memories, etc. So I think you do need to really be sort of prepared and armed and yeah, quite solid as a gender expert before you can be a gender trainer that does really a training that is in depth and not just something superficial.
Not just superficial. I agree. That's a very good point. And I think we're coming to an end because we're almost out of time. But we have one question. I don't know if
Okay.
you can see the questions tab, because Lucy Fabien has asked from Montreal. Maybe can you see the questions tab? It's
No,
no. Okay.
I'm
It's on
sorry.
the. That's okay. That's okay. We'll work it out. She's asked an interesting question, which I think I'm going to translate from French. My French is not the best, which is a terrible thing to admit on a podcast about yeah, Francophone training. But I think she's asking about your experiences of government training. And I suppose where exactly you have given government training and what your experiences have been like in government institutions.
Okay. Most of the government training I did was really in French setting, in the French Foreign Ministry or in the French Development Bank, Agence Française de Développement. I did some, I contributed to some government training in the Moroccan setting. But this is just sort of a sideline, but I do think it's very important that there are local trainers when you're actually training in other places, at least amongst the team. I'm very much aware of the importance of having sort of local gender experts and trainers with me, or even without me. So yeah, those are my experiences are of a great diversity, actually. In the courses I did, and I did all in all about 7 of them, I think, or 8. There's always a diversity. There's some people that are very much motivated, and others that are really here because they feel that it's the thing they should do, and they have sort of been pressured to go there. So obviously the initial motivation is important because you don't have the same sort of expectations either. Very often when people are motivated or when they become convinced, the question that comes up is really their leeway. How much can they really do inside the procedures they have to respect, inside the sort of official policies, and inside all the sort of bureaucratic process they have to work in. How much can they really do to call things into question and to try and be more creative in, for example, creating other settings for participation. I mean, we are very much in France, for example, there's always this strong accent on parity. We want 50% women, 50% men. And once there's 50% women in the room, we don't really care anymore on who speaks and who is really being listened to. Those are issues that come up. What can we really do at our level to improve things with all the restrictions and all the constraints that public agents face? This is one of the things that comes up quite a lot. Yeah. But apart from that, there is also very many motivated people in the governments, and people that have strong engagements also for gender equality, in favor of gender equality. So I think that's the other important issue, to identify sort of allies, or to identify people that can really put forward this question of gender again and again at all levels, at every meeting, etc. Because that's how things advance as well, next to sort of gender policies, official engagements, and official strategies and gender plans.
I agree. I think the Alliance's point is very, very well made. And with that, we're out of time. But thank you so much, Elisabeth, for your wonderful insights. It's been an excellent interview. And thank you, everyone who participated. And we'll be posting this on YouTube. And, everyone watching this on YouTube will know that already. And thank you so much. And we wish you all a wonderful day. And we will also continue discussions on this on the COP discussion forum. So we invite everyone to come there and to continue speaking about this incredibly interesting subject. Thank you very much, Elisabeth.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.